He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And people were bringing children to him that he might touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he became indignant and said to them, "Let the children come to me. Do not prevent them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I mean what I say to you. Whoever does not accept the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it." Then he embraced them and blessed them, placing his hands on them. The Gospel of the Lord.
No Christian wants to be part of a society that has its sights set on godlessness, a society that through its laws or through its actions attempts to drive away God and weed out the natural law. I think we'd all agree that that would be a pretty awful society to live in. But if you can believe it, there's another type of society that's actually even worse than that. And that's the type of society where a type of society that's so oblivious that it allows God to be replaced, by a cheap substitute, with hardly anyone ever even noticing. The godless society dies a quick death, a brutal death, but a quick one. Not so for the society that allows for God to be replaced. That society dies a slow death, a painful one. It walks around looking relatively put together, but beneath this mostly attractive appearance is this stage 4 cancer just eating away at its organs. I hate to say it, but it feels very much, to me at least, sometimes like we are that second society, that society that is allowed for God to be replaced. Brothers and sisters, we're living through this great period of bait and switch, the devil's sleight of hand, the replacing of the truth with your truth and my truth, the replacing of eternal beauty with temporal and fading delights. And it's happening so subtly, so tactfully, that all of a sudden we find ourselves very much caught off guard by the present reality. And that is to say that we're no longer people rejoicing to be made in the image and likeness of God, but rather to have a God that we have made in our image and likeness. Not an eternal and perfect God who partakes in our human messiness so that we can be drawn to great heights of holiness, but a flawed and unspecial God who asks almost nothing of us. Not a God of virtues and challenges worthy of the eternal nature of our souls, but a God of empty affirmations and damaging complacency. That's not a God of people who yearn for heaven. That's a God of people who are already building themselves a home in hell, but just don't know it yet. And we just don't know it because ultimately we are not the masterminds behind this destructive plan. Satan is the real chief architect, the foreman of this devastating building project that we are unknowingly undertaking. And so we have to stop to ask ourselves as Catholics, what is Satan's plan? How is he trying to replace God? Where is he trying to replace God first, and why? Why? The answer is right there in our readings today: marriage. Marriage. Because if you can change what people think about marriage, you can change what people think about God. And if you can change what people think about God, you can recreate the world to your liking and become its ruler, a bait and switch. Marriage is a sacrament. We all know this is one of the 7, but think about what that means for marriage to be a sacrament. A sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. For instance, God's healing power is oftentimes invisible, so we show it through oil and the laying on of hands. Baptism into the church is invisible, so we show it through water and the wearing of a white garment. Likewise, the sacrament of marriage makes known to us an invisible reality, the reality of God's love for his church. The reality that God is so close to the human race that through his sacrifice on the cross, we have become part of his very body. We who were once separated from God are separated no more, but rather have become with him one flesh, flesh united by sacrifice, preserved in fidelity, bearing fruit through unity. Marriage, albeit a union of persons, is a godly reality. It tells us about who God is. It's a bringing to life of the truth of the gospel in the form of the bond between a man and a woman, as we hear in our reading from Genesis. What an incredible thing, what an unbelievable witness to the world that God is alive, that his love is alive in his people. What is joined through the sacrament, no one can tear asunder. What is purchased by the wood of the cross can never be taken away. But what if we were to fail to safeguard that sacrament, fail to preserve it in its form and in its purpose? What if we were to allow the sacrament of marriage to be tweaked, to be altered, to be poked and prodded, and to have its pieces replaced, like a Jenga tower on the verge of collapse? Wouldn't it follow that we would not only be allowing for the distortion of a sacrament, but also for the distortion of our communal perception of God? Think about it. Here's just a few examples. We have allowed for marriage without openness to new life in the form of children to become normal in our society. But what does that tell us about God? It tells us that God's love bears no fruit, orders to become normal in our society. But what does that tell us about God? It tells us that his love finds a home in infidelity, that it seeks out other options when its desires are not met. And of course, that's not true. We've allowed for marriage as a natural next step to cohabitation to become normal in our society. But what does that tell us about God? It tells us that there's nothing really special about his love at all. It's essentially no different from normal human love, and that's not true. We've allowed for marriage predicated upon the acceptance of the possibility of divorce, sacrament of marriage. This sacrament that was established by God at the creation of the world, the beginning of the world. Should it be any surprise then that we've come to believe so many lies about the fundamental nature of God? Of course not. All in Satan's plan. Attack God not by destroying him, but by replacing him with a decoy. Not a God who inspires conversion and self-sacrifice and growth in holiness, but one who simply reflects the weakness of our fallen nature. And once God is replaced by a decoy, he becomes insignificant to the point of dismissal. And then we can go about doing things our own way once we've dismissed God, all the while embracing this idea that our own way is actually God's way. And of course, it's not. But there is a way out of this dark, his strategy. In our gospel today, Jesus points out to the Pharisees that Moses, knowing the hardness of hearts of the Israelite people, allowed for divorce in the law, but it was never God's plan. Jesus makes this very clear. He says the people moved away from marriage as an ideal established by God at the creation of the human race, and instead embraced a lesser reality for themselves. Why? Why did they do that? Well, because they had become jaded. They had seen the messiness of life. They had experienced their own sinfulness firsthand, and they lowered the bar for themselves. It makes sense. And it's hard to imagine that this abandoning of the ideal, because of its difficulty, didn't have something to do with Israel's constant disbelief that God truly desired to form a covenant with them. Although God never abandoned his promise to the people of Israel, the people could never fully believe in God's fidelity. They couldn't believe it because it was something that they had already abandoned in their own lives. Brothers and sisters, many of you have been hurt in your marriages. Many of you have experienced divorce or separation, heartbreak of all sorts. Many of you have been let down by your spouses, or perhaps even worse, you've let yourselves down. And as much as I hate to say it, that's life. Life is hard, and marriage is among the hardest things that we are asked to do as human beings. But it's so worthwhile. It's so worthwhile, not only because it brings out the best in us if we let it, but because it brings to life the truth of God. It makes manifest in this world the reality that God's love is real and it endures, that God has made a bond with us and will never go back on his promises. People need to know this, and it's up to all of you, all of us, to make sure that this happens. Every single one of you who participates in the sacrament of marriage, this is up to you. It's up to you to disrupt Satan's plan, his plan to replace the true God with a diminished God, to belittle God's love. And if you're not married, do everything you can to uphold the dignity of this sacrament. Speak of it with reverence, promote it, encourage others in it. Marriage is a sacrament meant for the good of the community. And if you're part of the community of believers, you should be sharing and promoting the benefits of marriage. We can't become jaded. Don't let your hurts and your shortcomings harden your heart. Don't turn away from an eternal ideal just because you've experienced the worst of human nature in yourself or perhaps in another. Don't believe that your imperfect living out of a sacrament is reflective of God's imperfect love for you. No, we need to be patient with ourselves. We need to accept that this idea of marriage is an incredible challenge, and we need to let the pursuit of this ideal draw us to conversion and levels of holiness that we never before thought possible. That's the goal of marriage, for spouses to challenge each other to godliness by imitating God's perfect love, however imperfectly. Don't let your hearts be hardened, but rather pray that you might have the strength to become a witness to God's fidelity, to the reality that he has become one flesh with his church to draw every man and woman into the wonder of his love.